going to speak about the subject of mind manipulation, which is a very touchy issue. And it has been used throughout the ages to decide, most of the time, let's say all the time, arbitrarily, that someone who is claiming to have certain ideas of his own and based on his free will is in fact not in control of himself anymore, and that his ideas are not to be considered as his own, but as a product of an undue influence from others. And when this concept comes into the law, then many problems arise due to the vagueness of the concept of mind manipulation, whether it is called brainwashing, psychological subjection, mind control, or else. So in my presentation, I will not go back further than the 20th century, because I'm not doing a historical and philosophical complete review of the subject of mind manipulation, but I want to do something useful to understand why it is so dangerous to use vague concept as mind manipulation now. So the first instance of the use of mind manipulation in the law in the 20th century was in Italy with the Plagio law. It was under Mussolini, and it was a criminal offense of putting someone in a complete state of subjugation. It was the idea of Mussolini was that communists were communists because they were under undue influence from other people, other communists, you know. It's like a disease, you know. And with this law, it could be criminal to influence someone to be a communist, so he could put some opponents in jail just using this law. Very easy to use, you know. So after World War II, the law was still in use, but then it has been used against the homosexuals because homosexuality was considered to be a way to manipulate people and to put them in a state of psychological subjection. However, the last scandal of this law was in the 70s, and it was because a Catholic priest has been attacked with this law, and he has been accused of estranging his young disciples from their families. He was not an homosexual, he was not a communist, he was only asking strict application of the Christian precepts in the community he was leading, and he had a great faith and commitment. Well, this has been a big scandal, and the case has been referred to the Italian Constitutional Court, which repealed the Plagio law in 1981. And then the Constitutional Court said that this law was, and I quote, a mine floating in our judicial system that can be applied to any instance involving the psychological dependence of a human being upon another human being. Well, that could apply, of course, to any advertisement that you see in television, you know, which is having the undue influence to give you a want to buy some products. This could apply to any teacher that would have the undue influence to shape your mind in one side or another. So the Constitutional Court decision also stated that some typical instances of psychological dependence can also reach heightened levels over more or less extended periods, as in the case of romantic relationships, or the relationships between priest and believer, teacher and pupil, doctor and patient. It was quite a good decision that the Constitutional Court took at this time. So it was in 81. At the same time that Mussolini, another great man, has had the idea that the state should be able to protect citizens from undue influence of subversive people. And I'm very sorry for the bad joke, because the man that I called a great man was Adolf Hitler. Indeed, in February 1933, the Chancellor of the Republic of Weimar, Adolf Hitler, signed a presidential law called, and I'm sorry because it's not pronounceable for me, it's Reichstag-Brandverordnung, something like that. And this law was cancelling the democratic principles of the Republic and was restraining the individual's freedoms like never before. In this law was established a list of cults, and they were forbidden in the name of the protection of the people and the state. The list included Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, Anabaptists, Theosophy, and so forth. The justification of this list was an order given by the Nazi Reinhard Heydrich, which was he was the chief of Gestapo. And you can find this order in D59 in the files of the Nuremberg trial, if you want to find it. And this order gives the guidelines to get rid of what he calls religious societies and cults, and get followers arrested and deported in concentration camps. And the preamble of the order is compelling, and I quote, "In this struggle for the fate of the German people, it is necessary to protect not only the physical health of our people, but also their spiritual health, both individually and collectively. The German people cannot be exposed to occult teachings claiming that the action and tasks of human beings are prone to mysterious magical forces." As you can see, the German Nazi state thought it had to protect the German against undue influence in the field of spirituality, to protect their spiritual health. Even if the words mind manipulation are not used, the concept is exactly the same. If you say occult teaching, and if you say it's a threat, it's exactly the same that mind manipulation to spread false belief for other people, you know. But some could say that this is the past, and both the plagiar law and the Reichstag, etc. laws that I quoted were abolished in the 40s for the second and in the early 80s for the first. However, the concept of mind manipulation appeared to be so useful for people opposed to new religious movement in France that they started to speak about it not long after the plagiar law was repealed. And in the early 90s, some plans have been made to lobby the French members of the parliament and members of the government so such a law on mind manipulation could be voted. The way they define it is, of course, a law against what they called cults, which is the French word today. Well, in France we say sects, and in English sects mean cult. Not the same meaning exactly. So, of course, the problem these people were bumping into was when they wanted to attack what they called cults or new religious movements. They were facing followers who were obviously doing it from their own free will and who did not want to attack their own movements. So, to prove that they had been forced, even without violence, they had to use something like mind manipulation. And it could open the door to convictions, despite, even if you don't, you can be a victim without knowing it. Even if you don't complain against a movement, you can be said to be a victim because, well, you have been mind manipulated. Even if you say, no, I've not been forced, I've not been manipulated, then you still can be, I mean, the movement can be prosecuted. Which is to say that even if you are a very happy follower of a religion or of a philosophical movement, but that they decided to call your religion a cult, for example, your movement or your religion could be accused of manipulating you. Moreover, that was also opening the door to former followers who want to attack their former movements, to have a legal ground for it, even if at the time they were in the movement, they were adults in very good shape and absolutely aware of what they were doing. It is easy to say that you were manipulated and quite hard to prove the contrary, as there is no precise objective criteria to establish that. Actually, the brainwashing issue regarding new religious movements has already been an issue in the United States for a long time. But major studies by the leading authorities in the field and by organizations such as the American Psychological Association and the American Sociological Association, debunks the myth of brainwashing as it applies to new religious movements. Also, the European Court of Human Rights, in a recent decision regarding the Jehovah's Witnesses against Russia, has also tackled this concept of mind manipulation, and they ruled that there was absolutely no scientific consensus that religious mind control could exist. However, in France in the 90s and in 2000, there have been a lot of discussions about this mind manipulation, and many opponents to a law that would incriminate a crime of mental manipulation. Leaders from all faiths, including mainstream ones, opposed to it, because they knew it could be applied to anyone choosing to follow a religious life. And you have the Catholic Church, the Protestant Church, the Muslim and the Jewish, which are the mainstream religions in France, have been opposing to this law. And they were right, but it was not enough to be right, because the 12th June 2001, the law on mind manipulation, which is called Abubakar law in France, from the name of Nicolas Abou and Catherine Picard, who were the members of the parliament who prepared this law has been voted in France. And the only concession they made was to replace the expression mind manipulation by psychological subjection. They switched the word. But it's quite ironical, because it is almost worse, because this is the exact same formulation than the plagial law of Mussolini. So they went back to the 30s with a new plagial law on psychological subjection. Even then, this law has been the subject of numerous critics throughout the world. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, many human rights institutions, but also the US governments did strongly criticize this law. So France tried to gain some allies and started to lobby at various levels to not be the only ones to have such a law, because unity is strength. And actually they started to convince others to follow this path. So now Belgium has adopted a similar law, which has been voted in 2011 and came into force the 2 February 2012. This law is a copycat of the Abubakar French law. And there is something quite amusing, is that there is now a first complaint in Belgium. It is the only one today in Belgium, which is using this law, and it is against the Belgian Office of Childhood and Birth, and it's by a family whose child has been excluded from school because they refused him to be vaccinated. And normally, the law is used against people who refuse vaccination. In France, they love that, you know. People who refuse vaccination are all coming from a cult. Everybody knows that. But then it is a family who refused, who prosecuted the office who get the exclusion from the school, saying that they were the ones manipulating people to get this result. So it's amusing, you know, how you can use this law quite arbitrarily. Then now Luxembourg voted also a similar law, which has come into force 25 May 2012, and it is still a copycat of the Abubakar law. So now we have a French law, a Belgian law, a Luxembourg law, and these laws are merely modern versions of the Mussolini plagial law. Now, let me give you some examples of the use of the law, for example, in France, to see that this law is not even useful for anybody. First of all, 10 years after the law was voted, only 35 convictions were happened with this law in 10 years, which is very low for any kind of law, criminal law, you know. So on 35 convictions, only 2 or 3 were concerning cults, or what they call cults. All the others were some mental manipulation by some guy, again, his grandmother, or again, an old lady. And I can tell you that the former president of France, Nicolas Sarkozy, after he has been beaten by the new president, he has been prosecuted with this law because he has been accused to have abused the weakness of an old lady who is the richest lady in France for her to pay money for his political campaign. So he was prosecuted with the law Abubakar, which is quite, well, at the end he won. He has not been finally convicted, But that means that it is really a law that you can use to attack your enemies, because nobody can say, if it's very difficult to say if somebody is manipulated psychologically, And I don't know who could say with certainty that your idea is yours or not. So it's very arbitrary, It's exactly like Mussolini was using that to get rid of opponents. Then this is the way this law is used. And I have another example, which is anecdotic, but which is an example of the kind of strange things that can happen today with this concept of psychological subjection. It's a case that has been judged in France this year. A leader of a Christian so-called cult has been convicted for having conducted sexual orgies with her followers. And some of the followers had done the exact same thing than her. So I do not know if she was really guilty or not. But if she was, then for sure they were too, because they did the same thing. But as they said that they were under psychological subjection due to the charisma of their leader, and then they have been considered as victims instead of being convicted too. It's an easy way to avoid one's responsibilities, So these laws are real threats to democracy, as they open the door to arbitrary decision by courts. And who can say against which group they will be used in the future? The right to convince people of your own faith is a human right. It's covered either by free speech, which is Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, and freedom of religion or belief, which is Article 9. But who can say that when you are trying to convince your fellow, you are not manipulating him mentally? Today, one group is considered as a cult, as the Christians were almost 2,000 years ago, and as every new religion is, actually. And tomorrow, or even today, in fact, mainstream religions are also considered as cults and can be prosecuted for preaching the gospel or their equivalent, because every religion is a minority somewhere. But it's not only for religion. Every movement which is considered as an opponent that one must get rid of can be labeled as a sect. In France, for example, even individuals who preach another gospel than the mainstream one are called a sect. I mean, even one guy can be called a sect by himself, It's very strong. And also political parties, they start to call each other a sect. The enemy is always a sect. And I think the last year there is not one political party in France which has not been called a sect by the others. So we have a lot of sects now in political world in France. Well, I think for the political parties it's maybe true, but that's another idea. However, every government which would want to get rid of opponents and is not committed 100% to democracy and fundamental freedoms will be attracted by this new kind of laws, which is not new. Even in very democratic countries, you may have people who could try to convince honest politicians, yes, that might exist, that cults are so dangerous that this law is very legitimate due to the harm that cults might do. And if these politicians are not really educated on what it means for democracy, you will see the disease extend throughout Europe. But we are the doctors, and our speech, based on human fundamental rights, is a medicine. Well, for my conclusion, let's go back to the 1st century. I give you a little story coming from the Bible, which could tell us the best way to deal with new religious movements, even if you are in doubt regarding their legitimacy. When the apostles Pierre and Jean went before the Sanhedrin was the supreme Jewish court in Jerusalem in the 1st century, to be judged. Of course, they were preaching the gospel, which was very subversive and considered as a way to manipulate the mind of people. A brave member of the Sanhedrin, Gamaliel the elder, stood up and said to his fellow members of the court, I quote, I was not there, but it's in the Bible. So he said, therefore, in the present case, I advise you, leave these men alone. Let them go. For if their purpose or activity is of human origin, it will fail. But if it is from God, you will not be able to stop these men. You will only find yourself fighting against God. And that's my conclusion. Thank you.